Ships can take an achingly long time to sink. The Titanic sank nearly 3 hours after hitting the iceberg. The Republic, another White Star Line ship, slowly sank in the Atlantic over more than a day. In most cases, a slow sinking is the best of a terrible situation. There is time to get to safety, but sometimes it becomes hours of terror, like the sinking of the South Korean ferry Seawall. In this video, we're breaking down the devastating disaster of the Seawall, the South Korean ferry that sank in 2014. On the evening of April 15, 2014, 325 students from Danwon High School took the ferry Seawall at the port of Incheon. The teens were on a field trip to Jeju, a tropical island in the southwest corner of the Korean peninsula. The ferry was due to depart at 6:30. But a low visibility warning kept the ship in port until 9 p.m. Along with the students, another 118 passengers were on board, 33 crew, and over 2,000 tons of cargo. At the helm was Captain Lee Jun-sok, a veteran with over 40 years of experience. The 264 miles, 425 kilometers, voyage was routine. The Seawall made 3 round trips a week, each way taking about 13 hours. Most of the journey was unremarkable. Groups of teens huddled together laughing at their cell phones, breakfast served in the cafeteria as Seawall entered the main Gulf Channel, nearing its destination. At 8:50 a.m. on April 16, the ship began to tilt. The crew had lost control of the vessel after making a sharp turn in the notoriously violent waters near the island of Jeondu. At 8:52, startled passengers heard the first announcement over the intercom. Do not move. Just stay where you are. It's dangerous if you move, so just stay where you are. The Seawall was tilted 30 degrees to port, and something was obviously very wrong. Surprisingly, the first distress call was not issued by the captain or the communications officer, but by a high school student who called the National Emergency Service number and reported that the ferry had begun to capsize. The Mokpo Coast Guard Station sent a patrol vessel to the scene. Distress calls were sent around 9 a.m., with nearby vessels being called upon to help. Communication with the Jeondu Vehicles Traffic Service, VTS, began as the Seawall continued to fall further to port, leaving it listing at more than 50 degrees by 9:20. Still, passengers were told to stay put. At this point, people were pressed against walls for balance. In one haunting video, a teenage girl says, "Isn't this the kind of situation when they tell you stay put, it will be okay, and then they run away for their lives?" Her friends laugh a bit. She recalls a subway accident where passengers were told to stay put. Only the people who didn't follow the order survived. The ship's communication system was out of order, leaving the crew to spread information on foot. At 9:23, passengers were told to wear more clothing and don their life jackets. At 9:25, VTS called Captain Lee to decide on evacuation. Lee asked about the ETA of rescue vehicles, seemingly avoiding the question. Coast Guard Patrol Vessel number 123 arrived around 9:30 with orders to help save who they could and report on the situation. Several commercial vessels had already been on hand, pulling passengers from the water. Still, people on board were told to remain where they were. One woman ignored advice to stay in her cabin when it began filling with water, an act of disobedience that saved her life. Most students stayed put, listening to their teachers who were sure that the announcements from the crew and captain were trustworthy. Rescuers on number 123 called for anyone they could see to jump into the water and dispatched a rubber boat to assist with pulling people from the water. But they never attempted to organize an evacuation or communicate with the crew to develop a rescue plan. The 9-person team on number 123 was unprepared and wasted precious time with indecisiveness. While still telling everyone else to stay put, Captain Lee, along with his helmsman and first and second mates, stepped aboard Vessel 123, abandoning the hundreds of passengers who remained on board, held in place by his orders. By 10 o'clock, the ferry was nearly completely lying on one side, leaving rescuers only able to help visible people from the upturned side. Passengers on board texted their loved ones and called to say goodbye. Now unable to evacuate, they were trapped in a sinking grave. Hundreds of passengers who chose to take their chances in the water as soon as the ship tilted were rescued. Dozens more were saved by helicopters as they crouched on the side of the vessel. But by 10:23, only the front end of the upturned ship was visible, and an hour later, it settled with just the tip of the bow visible. It was a stunning and heartbreaking sight. A smattering of small boats dotted with passengers in bright orange life jackets, while over 300 souls sank below them. There had been enough time to get everyone off, yet most passengers did not survive. What should have been a story of triumphant rescue had turned into a failure of epic proportions. In the aftermath of the sinking of the seawall, details emerged about the entirely avoidable wreck and the blunders that were made at every turn. On the day the ferry sank, it carried more than twice the legal limit of cargo. The ferry had room for 97 cars, but held 185 that day. The vehicles and containers were improperly fastened, so the crew could squeeze more cargo on board. Plus, the ferry had been drained of most of its ballast water, which is needed for balance, so it would not appear too low in the water. Captain Lee had listed the cargo as 657 tons, and port officials didn't inspect the holds, perhaps because the ship's owner had treated them to drinks and free trips the year prior when the seawall was undergoing safety inspections. Those inspections were necessary after the ship's owner made several renovations, like extra berths, which dangerously raised the ship's center of gravity. The seawall was designed for maximum profit, but with little regard for safety. The renovations were completed illegally, and despite knowing this, the Regional Port Administration licensed the ferry. When the ferry turned into the channel, the sharp movement caused the badly balanced ship to tilt. The excess, unsecured cargo slid toward the tilt, forcing the ferry further onto its side. There were still things that could have been done to save the lives on board once the ship tilted. The crew had no clear procedures for evacuation, or even a hierarchy of communication in place. Captain Lee made no move to establish order, and no one seemed to question the incredible lack of urgency. Lee would later claim that he had issued an evacuation order before fleeing the sinking ship, but the fact that hundreds of passengers remained in place suggests otherwise. The captain and crew would have plenty to answer for. Lee and 14 other crew members were convicted on charges related to the sinking, but they certainly weren't the only ones at fault. On the day of the sinking, President Park Geun-hye was almost entirely absent, staying in her bedroom in the Blue House, holding meetings and getting her hair done. She didn't address the nation until 7 hours after the ship began to sink. That's a big blunder for the person who is, according to the government's crisis guidelines, meant to act as a key decision maker. The Coast Guard failed the victims of the ferry disaster as well. Despite knowing the grave situation, they sent only one rescue team in the early moments of the sinking, when decisive action was most necessary. In the end, civilian and commercial vehicles were responsible for most of the rescues. Perhaps worst of all was the terrible false news reports that rolled out during and in the hours after the sinking. At 11 a.m., one news outlet reported that all students had been rescued. Parents of students on board began receiving text messages from the education department saying their children were safe. But as time passed, reports changed to saying most passengers were rescued. Then most were missing. In the end, 304 passengers were killed in the sinking, 250 of them students. Arrest warrants were issued for a senior vessel safety operator and a vessel inspector in relation to the sinking. The captain was sentenced to 36 years in prison for negligence, while the chief engineer was found guilty of murder and jailed for 30 years. 13 other crew members were given jail sentences of up to 20 years. The company's CEO was found guilty of negligence for cargo overloading, and received a 10-year prison term. The captain's sentence was later increased to life imprisonment on appeal, while the sentences of the 14 other crew members were reduced. President Park was ousted from office amid public outcry over the handling of the disaster and investigations. There were repeated blatant attempts to cover up or skew information about the disaster to paint the government in a better light. But no one in the Coast Guard or the control tower, the Blue House, was held responsible. Families of the victims still have few answers about how so many organizations failed them. Park's former prime minister designated records of her actions on the day of the sinking as presidential records when he became acting president following Park's impeachment. That means the public cannot access them for up to 30 years. The seawall was salvaged in March 2017 in a massive operation to raise the ferry intact so it could be searched for the 9 passengers whose bodies remained missing. DNA testing was necessary to identify the remains on board, but 5 victims, 3 students, a teacher, and a father and son, remain unaccounted for. The safety standards and laws set in place in the transportation industry have been developed for a reason, and that is to keep everyone safe. And the blatant disregard for these regulations by the parties involved in this incident shows the price of negligence. As victims' families continue to press for answers and demand accountability, the sinking of the seawall stands as a testament to the dangers of corruption, greed, and an unprepared crew.